Hello and welcome to the Somerville Media Center's continuing coverage of election 2020. I'm Joe Lynch. It is my pleasure to welcome the Democratic Congressman from the Massachusetts 4th Congressional District and candidate for the United States Senate, Congressman Joseph P. Kennedy III. Joe Kennedy was elected to the Congress in 2012 and will face Senator Edward Markey in the September 1st, 2020 primary here in Massachusetts. The Congressman lives in Newton with his wife and 2 children. Once again, it is my pleasure to welcome him to the Somerville Media Center. Congressman, thanks for joining us this morning.
Joe, thank you so much for having me. Good morning.
I know it's a busy campaign. You've got a little over 3 weeks left. Thank you so much for coming back to Somerville. You were making some earlier appearances in person here, but Somerville wants to hear again from you.
I'm grateful for the opportunity. We've been in Somerville quite a bit over the course of this campaign, and look, that's what it's all about. It is politics, no matter what, it's still about people. And I think the best way of showing that is the way you campaign. It's about meeting people where they are, asking them questions, listening to their concerns, and trying to shape those concerns into legislation to help alleviate those burdens. I believe politics, government can make a difference, and our obligation is to try.
Joe, let's do this. I'll let you call me Joe and I'll call you Joe. How's that?
That's perfect. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. So let's get right into it, Joe. The pandemic has had catastrophic effects on not only people's health, their mental well-being, but the economy. It has peeled off a lot of Band-Aids on our healthcare system. I want to talk just briefly about your assessment on what the president and the Congress are doing at this point, and whether or not you think it's enough to address the issue that we have in front of us during this pandemic.
Joe, I think without question, the president and his administration did enough, and I don't think there's any doubt about that. This pandemic, without debate, would have been a challenge for any administration, so I don't want to minimize the threat of what a global pandemic would mean for anybody. But given that, we are now 8 months into the first cases arriving on our shores here in the United States. We still do not have adequate testing. We still do not have adequate access to personal protective equipment, PPE. We've had over 4.5 million people get sick. We are averaging now still across our country 1,000 fatalities a day. The idea that the most powerful nation in the world cannot create its own masks and gloves and gowns and care for its people in a humane way to ensure the safety and security of American families is a stunning indictment of this administration. And so without question, they get enough. Congress, look, I think there's obviously a whole lot more that is necessary and needs to be done. I do think a lot of that comes from a lack of leadership at the White House. The House of Representatives, as you know, passed the CARES Act, over $3 trillion of support several months ago, and has passed also the HEROES Act, over $3 trillion of additional support for states and municipalities to do things like fund childcare and teachers so that schools can, in fact, safely reopen if conditions are right. More aid to families, more aid to small businesses, more aid to community health centers and our healthcare system, money for testing, the complete kind of wraparound services that are needed and necessary in order to make sure that we can, in fact, get back on track. And that plan is collecting dust on the desk of Senator Mitch McConnell and in the United States Senate. We need to get that bill passed, and we need stronger leadership in the Senate to do so.
On the Senate side, we've got almost gridlock, that no matter what the Democrats want to do, the Republicans are going to block it. Going forward, Joe, I mean, if you are successful in September, going forward, how do you propose as a United States Senator to break that gridlock when it comes to the important, because this isn't going away. The pandemic isn't going away. The long-term effects of this are going to require huge amounts of money, and it requires both the House and the Senate getting on board. How do you break that if you're successful getting into the Senate?
A couple of ways, Joe. First is you fight to remove the roadblocks that are prohibiting us from actually being able to deliver change. So that's a series of democracy reforms, like ending the filibuster, political gerrymandering, campaign finance reform, strengthening the Voting Rights Act, to actually make our system more accountable to its people. That's first. Second, I've actually been able, ever since I came to Congress, in order to pass legislation, I've needed Republicans to actually get on board with it. But that has not stopped me from passing critical mental health legislation to ensure, for instance, that pregnant moms or pregnant women and young moms get guaranteed access to mental health care, from making hearing aids more affordable, to overhauling and investing in our advanced manufacturing industry, creating a national network of manufacturing innovation all over this country. Because whether people want to focus on it or not, there are, in fact, commonalities that unite us as people. And I'll tell you this today, Wednesday, just last night, we saw another red state vote for Medicaid expansion because we are in the midst of a pandemic and people understand the need for healthcare. Healthcare has been one of the leading causes of my time in Congress: mental health and behavioral health, and overall access to equitable healthcare. And should I be fortunate enough to serve in the United States Senate, I will make access to healthcare and Medicare for all my lead fight once I get there.
So it is Medicare for all is the topic of the day, because a pandemic serves up healthcare right on the platter. And it says if you don't have adequate healthcare, basically you're doomed during a pandemic. So my question to you is, on the healthcare front, there are so many aspects of it. Medicare for all, that is something that you would have in the forefront if you're successful getting into the Senate.
Yes, and Joe, the basics on this are basic. If there is a lesson to be learned, and there's several, but if there's a lesson to be learned from this pandemic, it's, Joe, that your health and my health are linked, that you are not going to eradicate a pandemic if I just focus on my own healthcare.
We froze there just for a minute, Joe.
Eradicate this pandemic if I'm focused solely on my healthcare and not concerned about whether we're actually treating people and preventing the spread of this disease for others. That is how this disease festers. That is how we've seen in communities that were successful and in countries that were successful at curtailing the spread of this virus. Now it's back. And so we need to act to ensure that not only that people get access or get coverage for that healthcare that they need, but that they get access to it. And that means having a system that is designed to meet people where they are, to wrap around the care that they need, to address structural barriers like pre-existing conditions, like food deserts and environmental justice communities, because we've seen that in communities like Chelsea and Lawrence and Revere and Springfield, that are where there's higher levels of pollution, that there's been a higher rates of infection for a respiratory disease. We need to do things like take down language barriers and cultural barriers to make sure that we have equity, not just in access, but equity in treatment. And that's what we need to do to ensure that our system is more resilient to another episode of this virus or another one, because this is not a one and done scenario here, right? This was the first major global pandemic in 100 years, but it doesn't mean it's not going to happen again.
Joe, I want to try to wrap the pandemic, healthcare, and the economy into a dialogue that all of us can understand. So the pandemic itself has created an enormous amount of pressure on the private healthcare systems that are out there, private hospitals that are non-government funded. What happens if the pandemic puts such pressure on these hospitals that we start to have a series of either clinics or hospital systems or any kind of healthcare system? What if they start to fail? What happens then? Because as you say, the pandemic is going to last into 2021.
Joe, the federal government has to step up. And that's where, again, the CARES Act and the HEROES Act provides billions of dollars for our healthcare system. But we also need to make sure that there's a stopgap here. And if we need to do more, we do more. Because you absolutely cannot be compromising our healthcare system in the midst of a global pandemic. If that's the case, the destruction of this virus is going to last for far longer and be far deeper than it otherwise would be. And so the federal government needs to roll up its sleeves and get engaged. But it's not just on the back end of saying, hey, we'll write our hospitals and healthcare centers a check on the back end. It's leaning forward to saying, hey, you know what? There needs to be a national order on masks across this country. If mask wearing is capable of reducing the spread of this disease by 70%, everybody should be wearing a mask if you're outside. We need that to take place. If there's a shortage of PPE, which there still is, gowns, gloves, masks, we need to mobilize our domestic manufacturing industry to give them, to ramp up that production, to give them clarity and certainty for long-term contracts with our government, to scale up those resources so that the American public can gain access to them and our frontline workers can gain access to them. There's a whole lot of things that can be done on the front end of this to make sure that we aren't just treating it on the back end. And that, again, is where the Trump administration has failed so miserably and actually providing us the pathway to ensure the health and safety of our citizens.
Let's wrap it right back into the economy. You know, a pandemic will offer opportunity for other people to transition to other types of jobs, or industry to transition to other types of industry, from the more traditional to, you know, retrofitting. We've seen that happen across Massachusetts. We've seen it happen across the United States. Why is the President of the United States so reluctant to use his powers to ramp up, to help the economy to do that? I don't get it, Joe, and I'm not sure most people who are not in the political world, we don't understand it. Why is he not doing that?
I don't understand it either, Joe. And look, my only guess, and I hate to speculate to try to get in the mind of President Trump, but I think what we've seen from his comments and statements over the course of the past several months is that by trying to divert attention, focus on other things, ignore the threat and the reality of this pandemic, he's hoping to wish it away and hoping that it's just people he can somehow turn the nation's attention onto something else. Joe, it's awfully hard to focus on something else when a family member of yours is sick, when you are out of work, when 45 million people have lost their jobs, when your friends and colleagues are scared of contracting a deadly virus, when parents around the country are wondering what they're going to do for a school season coming up literally in a matter of weeks. And if your kids can't go to school, your parents can't go to work. And if parents can't go to work, how are they going to pay their mortgage or their rent or their credit card bill? And this is the reality that so many American families are confronting. I've got 2 little kids. I would love to be able to send my kids back to school, but this administration has offered no plan on how to do so, no suggestions on how to do so, other than trying to order people back to school without providing our teachers, our educators, our schools, our communities, a plan or the resources necessary to prevent the spread of this virus.
Joe, when you say resources, I mean, you know, I try to take it down to what we say in the street, which is money. Where is the money going to come from for the municipalities and the local school districts to be able to keep these kids safe? As you may or may not know, the mayor of Somerville and the superintendent of schools made their decision yesterday. They're going to go virtual until this mayor and this superintendent and many of the parents feel that it is safe to send those kids back in to the physical facilities. We're not going to be alone in this. Somerville is not going to be alone. That's my opinion. We're going to have major metropolitan districts across this country and in Massachusetts who are going to have to make that decision. Where is the federal government with the money to support us?
The House of Representatives has already passed over $150 billion of support again, and that's sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk. There's, in the negotiations that House leadership is having with Senate Republicans and the White House now, we're actually trying to push that number up because that number was it's a lot of money. But Joe, that looks like a adequate number 2 months ago when we passed this bill. What we've seen because of a lack of leadership from the White House, we've seen the fact that this virus the spread has accelerated. It's devastated more communities across the country, and they're going to need more. And so we're pushing for more because, to boil this down for you, Massachusetts as a state, we've got about a $42 billion budget. 40% of that is actually healthcare, which you don't want to cut in the midst of a pandemic. 20% of it is education. And yet we're facing a nearly 20% budget shortfall just for the last fiscal year. The state doesn't have the money to be able to actually provide access to PPE, to bring more teachers in, to try to mobilize retirees to come in so we can reduce the class sizes and reduce spread. The state doesn't have those resources. The city certainly doesn't have those resources. The only entity that does is the federal government. And yet, as you said, we are still facing resistance from Donald Trump, from Betsy DeVos, from Republicans in the Senate, who are saying, absolutely not, we're not going to help. How do you not help American families in the midst of a global pandemic? How do you not help parents be able to know that they have confidence to care for their kids and earn a paycheck? This literally gets to the core of what government is supposed to be about and the core of what our nation is supposed to stand for. And this president won't do it.
Joe, it's about justice. I mean, I am preaching to the choir here. Justice, economic justice, healthcare justice, racial justice, social justice. I mean, you name it. It is about what is fair and what is just. In your a little over 3 weeks left, how is the campaign going? Anything that you want to wrap up with? Because I'm getting a message here from your folks that you are a busy man these days.
So, apologies on that one. I am busy these days. Look, it is about justice. And much of the themes that we touched on, Joe, are contained in the plan that I've actually rolled out called a Jobs and Justice Initiative that details the response that I proposed for COVID and the short-term immediate surge of funding, money, capacity to get through this crisis, and the long-term structural overhauls that are necessary in order to make our country more resilient and stronger to make sure we don't go through another one of these again. But the bottom line to this is we need change, and we need to ensure that we've got the leadership in Washington, D.C. that is going to fight for it. Change informed by the voices in our streets, in our communities in Massachusetts. Change informed by the voters of Massachusetts. Change informed by the realities of people across our Commonwealth. And that's why I got in this race, Joe. I risked my career because I believe in the people across our Commonwealth. I've given up my seat in the House, and I did that. I thought we were at a critical moment 9-10 months ago when I got in this race. I am more certain of it now. But as I've traveled around this Commonwealth, you see how hard people are fighting for themselves and for their families. The resilience that they show as they try to keep their small businesses open to fight for their employees. What they're doing to make sure that they're still able to put food on the table of their children and a roof over their heads so they don't face eviction. And I believe they need a senator fighting as hard for them as they are for their families. And I think we can do an awful lot better and an awful lot more than what we're getting at the moment.
Congressman Joe Kennedy, best wishes on September 1st. Be safe out there.
Thank you, Joe. You too. Be well.
Thank you very much. For the Somerville Media Center, I'm Joe Lynch. My guest has been Congressman Joseph Kennedy. As always, stay safe, stay informed. See you next time.